Hello, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you this morning on Channel 9 and also on WJOP-LP Newburyport, Joppa Radio at FM 96.3. We're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so excited this morning to be able to bring you such an important topic, the surge of interest in the white nationalist movement. And we have just the expert to talk about it with us today. Sophie Bjork-James is an assistant professor in the Anthropology Department at Vanderbilt University. She got her PhD at the City University of New York, and she has more than 10 years experience researching both the US-based religious right and the white nationalist movements. She's the co-editor of a book that came out in 2020 called Beyond Populism, Angry Politics and the Twilight of Neoliberalism. She's also the author of a book that came out from Rutgers University Press this year called The Divine Institution, White Evangelicalism's Politics of the Family. Sophie, welcome, and thank you so much for visiting us on the morning show today to talk about this important topic.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, thank you, Sophie. So, Sophie, let's dig in. You know, we've been hearing more and more about white nationalism ever since the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And now we've been hearing exponentially more since the January 6th insurrection. It seems important to define clearly what this movement is in order to understand the threat that it poses and how it's distinct from other forms of racism that we may be more familiar with, forms that might be based on prejudice that people hold, but aren't necessarily political or activist in nature. So let's start there, Sophie, if we could. Could you help us understand what white nationalism is and how it's distinct from, but may overlap with, a belief in white supremacy?
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question, because I think our definitions in general are not as developed as they could be in terms of thinking about racism. We today often think of racism as like a character flaw, right? As either someone with personal prejudice, that's more of a character flaw. You know, I kind of think of it like when my kids call each other stupid.
Yes.
It feels like that's how people's sense of it, right? It's more of a pejorative and negative trait, right? And so even like the white nationalists today will say, well, I'm not racist, right? I just know, it's not that I have an irrational belief in white supremacy. It's just I know that white people are better, right? And like white culture is better, right? So they'll say racism is now associated with irrational prejudice or a character flaw. So, you know, the first thing that this is what the researcher, writer Ibram Kendi, ex-Kendi says, you know, it's like the first reaction to any conversation about, you know, racism is that, well, I'm not a racist, like many white people will say. But we also have to think there's really great research now about implicit bias, right? That people can have. We can be biased, have racial bias, like that's implicit, that's at an unconscious level, so that we're not even aware of it, right? But then white nationalism is a social movement, right? In the United States, we have had an organized racist movement ever since the abolition of slavery, right? The KKK is founded at the close of the Civil War. Serves as a social movement, but also really as a terrorist organization in the 1870s, 1880s, is incredibly successful at ending Reconstruction, right? So you have the close of the Civil War, this first moment of actually trying to build a multiracial democracy, right? Moving from a white supremacist democracy to a multiracial democracy, and organized racism as a social movement with a terrorist arm emerges to quell that effort and succeeds, right? Succeeds in implementing Jim Crow laws, succeeds in broad spread terrorism of African-American communities, specifically often targeting African-American communities that are becoming very successful, right? That they succeed, so the KKK kind of becomes less prominent. In the 1920s, again, the KKK emerges. There's increasing immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. So people that are seen as like Catholic and Jewish, who were, even though they were from Europe, were not seen as white by the majority of Protestant Americans at the time. So the KKK reemerges in the 1920s, not as an underground terrorist organization, but as a as a overt political movement that in many parts of the country, people, in order to be elected into office in the 1920s, had to be affiliated with the KKK.
Yeah.
And it's no longer just in the South; it's largely in the West and the North as well. Right, and then again, the KKK at that time kind of falls apart because of both internal disorganization and because, again, they're successful, right, in passing these new anti-immigration laws passed that kind of limit for decades immigration to mainly Northern Europe. So what we see is at each point in US history, when there's been a real challenge to institutionalize racism, there's an organized movement to try to defend white supremacy and reinvest the state in white supremacy. And so, it's never gone away, right? There's moments where it becomes much more prominent and much more successful, but there's always been underground currents or social movements that are focused on reasserting racism, right? So white nationalism is a specific iteration of this. So Kathleen Belew, the historian, has written about the returning Vietnam vets in the 1970s in the US and kind of bringing together neo-Nazi anti-Semitism with the history of like anti-Black racism in the United States to form the white power movement, which in the 1980s, many racist leaders start defining themselves as white nationalists, taking language from the civil rights movement, saying, we're not white supremacists, we're white nationalists. If Black people can have pride, white people should be able to have pride, and we should be able to have our own territory, they would say. And so what's important is that it is a social movement, and their goal is their goal for hardcore white nationalists is to overthrow the U.S. government, to establish an all-white state, but also to just create chaos in the.
So, Sophie, that's very helpful because it places the current white nationalist surge within that historical context, which has always been with us in the United States in one form or another, kind of like a pendulum swinging and coming to new life whenever there is an advance toward actually manifesting a true multiracial democracy. So thank you for that. That's really interesting to have that context. One of the things that you've written about is in light of that historical progression of the movement, that there was a very deliberate and conscious rebranding of groups such as the Ku Klux Klan that was adopted in the 1980s, resulting in new language that they adopted, and that they were also early adopters of the internet as a tool for outreach and recruitment. So could you talk a little bit about why they felt the need for rebranding of racist organizing, why that became important, and what their new language was and how successful it's been?
Yeah, and I think, to understand this, we can also go back to the 1960s and 70s, right? So the American conservative movement had really, in the early 1970s, had really been harmed by the success of the civil rights movement and the fact that white conservatives were affiliated with pro-segregation, which suddenly was one could no longer have a successful political platform and be pro-segregation, right? And so what happens is that the religious right emerges as a virtually all-white movement in the 1970s, focused not on segregation, right, but on conservative religious values. I've studied the religious right. They very much stem from the history of racism in the United States and mobilized a form of white Christianity that in many ways kind of protects white privilege, but explicitly as a religious movement and not a racist movement. So what happens in the 1980s is these politically savvy former KKK members decide, they're never going to make a successful national political campaign saying that they're racist, right? When the KKK cannot reemerge in this post-civil rights context, right, as a successful movement, because it's associated again with irrational irrational prejudice.
Yeah.
Right. And so they adopt this language with the explicit goal. They're not trying to get, radical anti-racist leftist white people to join their movement. What they want, what they've been wanting is to form alliances with a broader conservative movement to make white supremacist ideas and white nationalist ideas more palatable. And so in an effort to make them more palatable, they adopted this new language, right, of like white pride and of white nationalism. And they also understood that the internet would give them what they could never, like a far larger audience than they could ever achieve through doing offline organizing. Right. And so they've been really craftily trying to create both online communities for people to gather and also disinformation campaigns. Right. So for, I think, over a decade, if you search for Martin Luther King on Google, one of the first few websites it would send you to was like The Truth About Martin Luther King, a white nationalist website. That, especially many students, it would take a while for them to realize like that this was actually a really biased website, like it was attempting to look like a, accurate historical website, right? And so they were using the internet to both recruit, retain, and, provide misinformation and a miseducation to try to encourage more people to join their movement.
So they adapted to the PR that they perceived themselves as needing politically at the time. And they were clever about it. And they were early users of technology is part of what you're talking about, in order to both shift the language and in some ways create kind of tricky, deceptive pathways to provide disinformation for people who either didn't know better or who were really attracted to that. So they found these pathways, and all of this was happening then from the, really, as you said, from the beginning of the civil rights movement on through the 80s and into the 90s. And so one of the things I wanted to clarify with you was what the impact then of Obama's election was, because, when Obama was elected, like many Americans, I was proud and so thrilled that we finally had a Black president, because it felt like a historical marker, transformational breakthrough of racial progress in the United States. And we were so happy about it. I think that we may have suffered a failure of imagination and got blindsided by the turbulence that was triggering in people who had been formerly Ku Klux Klan members or who now were fashioning themselves as white nationalists. So Sophie, just how significant a factor was Obama's election as the first Black president to the growing popularity and the increasing political potency of the white nationalism that we're seeing today?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's, it's hard to overstate, not just the fact that, the US elected the first African-American president, but in what that represents, both in terms of a broader embrace of anti-racism and demographic change, right? So the US is currently projected to become a majority minority country within like 20 years. 20 to 21 years will be this shift. And so there's something that social scientists call status threat, where people who occupy privileged positions in a society, when they fear that that status is threatened, can lead to supporting violence. It can lead to can lead to anxiety, right? And so even if it's not that, because I think that what ends up happening is people who are used to experiencing privilege, when they feel like that privilege is threatened, they feel like they could lose everything, right? As opposed to, and so I think what's happened is that for those of us who understand that anti-racism is possible, right? We can envision a multiracial democracy where that's equal, right? That is, so that's a benefit, right? It's not,
Yeah.
Like, me as a white person doesn't have to feel threatened by that because I value equality. I believe in the possibility of a multiracial democracy, and see that as a benefit for reducing past harms in terms of racism and present harms in terms of racism, and see that as like the ideal model. Many white Americans, and there's broad surveys that show this, many white, especially conservative Americans, do not see racism as a zero-sum game, to like use the title of an article that came out, I think about 10 years ago, based on survey data, where many white Americans, especially conservative white Americans, believe that it's not that there's a possibility of equality, that hierarchy will always be in place. And so if white people start losing their privilege, it means Black people and other people will suddenly become the supremacists, right? And that, and I think this is like a fear that really is driving a lot of white nationalism, is that this fear that it's not that we're going to achieve equality, right? That they believe that there's only going to be racial strife and racial inequality. And so if white people start losing privilege, it doesn't mean then that it's like everyone's rising together, everyone's fighting equality together. They really fear that they will be, and often actually the fear is that they will be subjected to the same kinds of violence that people of color have been subjected to. Like, this concept of white genocide, which is one of like the most, studies have shown it's the most common idea like circulated on the white supremacist right, is I feel like it's not it's ironic but also telling that a country founded on the genocide of Native peoples, right, that where we all kind of want to forget that, but it kind of haunts the American psyche, right, that is also that it's this idea of genocide of white people is like now motivating racists to try to maintain white power. So I think in some ways it's this crisis of imagination, right? Obama gets elected. And so those of us who believe in the possibility of equality are like, this is, like where we need to go, right? In terms of actually sharing power equally with all groups. For people who only see hierarchy, they see that as incredibly threatening. And so what that did is drove a lot of white people became more radicalized. But it also, I think, has moved what, for a long time, the model for understanding racism in the United States was like colorblind racism or racism without racist is this term, right? Like where, people saying like, I don't see color, like, I don't want to like, there's more like implicit bias or, like people wouldn't say things in public, white people wouldn't say racist things in public. And I think what happened with Obama, but also in like light of this like broader demographic change, is that many white Americans became very afraid that represented like changing power.
Yeah, Sophie, thank you so much. That's the clearest explanation I've ever heard about the inner psychological and emotional dynamics that kind of force this forward. And in a way, I have a psychological background, so I think of the return of the repressed in a way as the very sins of our forefathers and mothers are what many people start imagining will inevitably happen because there is a failure of imagination that we could actually have equality. We never have had equality in the United States. And so it's not so much not welcoming that as just really not being able to imagine anything other than, as you put it, the zero-sum game, competition for power and resources. So anything that you get then becomes something that I will lose, and you will do the same things to me then that are the only things I can imagine somebody then who has power would want to do or would enforce or coerce. So thank you for that. That was really clear and very helpful in understanding this dynamic. Thinking about the politics of today's situation, one of the things I was curious to ask you about was, white nationalists aren't the least bit shy about embracing Trump and being overt Trump supporters. They want him reinstated, and they're very clear and overt about this. But I'm often curious, do they actually see themselves as Republicans? or is the Republican Party in the form that it takes today anyway, seem like a convenience to them because they perceive a convergence of interests in terms of the current Republican Party's attitudes toward suppressing the vote of people of color and also their anti-immigration policies. So how does that work?
They are not Republicans. They have not. In my almost like my 15 years of studying this movement, they've never, garnered support for a mainstream Republican politician because of anti-Semitism. So, what distinguishes, the anti-Semitism has been, part of the racist American right forever. But, as there has been since the 1970s, this, more neo-Nazi element to it. And so, they certainly are like anti-immigrant, anti-Black, but really the heart is anti-Semitism and part of it is they think that, many Jews are now recognized as white, right? And so it's like this, which they don't believe, like white nationalists don't believe. And, they, at the center of their fears is this anti-Semitic conspiracy that like Jews are in charge of, every, the media, the banks, right, the politicians. And so largely because of over support for Israel, which, the Republican Party, mainly because of white evangelicals, but is very supportive of the state of Israel, of providing aid to Israel. The white nationalists have never seen themselves as Republicans, right? They don't see themselves as Democrats either, but largely, even though there's often a lot of agreement about anti-immigration, the support for Israel really goes against their anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So, for someone who studied both the religious right and the racist right, it was really interesting to see them come together around this figure of Trump.
Yeah.
But I think that, so there's, within the racist right, there's like the devout anti-Semitic people who, are gonna always toe that line. But then there's a lot of people who are very savvy about trying to increase their support, but also just to sow chaos. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the main goals of white nationalists is to overturn the U.S. government, because they believe it's secretly controlled by Jews. And tainted, and that Jews are responsible for the civil rights movement, they're responsible for multiculturalism, they're responsible for immigration, right? And so their goal is to overturn the U.S. government, and it gets a little murky in terms of what happens after that, but destabilizing democracy, undermining democracy, overturning the government, as steps towards overturning the government is part of their goal. And so, I think what many of these savvy actors see in the broader conservative movement and in the Republican Party is not a shared vision of the future. Right. The Republican Party clearly doesn't want to overthrow the U.S. state, right? But they see that in radicalizing conservative actors can undermine democracy and sow chaos, which is what they want. Right. And
as a follow-up to that, Sophie, I'm curious because you've written about, and I've read in other places about their desire to start call it a white-ethno state. And presumably then, because of a fundamental belief of theirs is that the races just aren't meant to live together and will never get along together. So they're part of the idea, and they're willing to use violence to get rid of our current democracy, is to somehow institute, I guess, a forced migration of anybody who's not white. And I don't know how that would work. Presumably, tens of millions of white people actually wouldn't want to have any part of their white ethno state. And so it's been confusing to me to think, is this something they actually think can happen and that would somehow work? Would they welcome a civil war? It would ensue absolute chaos. So I can't always tell whether it's simply like the mythology of a promised land that keeps them going and garners support because it's something they can work toward, a kind of a salvation. But that at some level, they must know that it's not actually ever going to happen. They would suffer from the same kind of dystopian chaos themselves if you actually undermine the government. I mean, all sorts of chaos would ensue, supply chains, the food supply, Wi-Fi towers. And so I can never actually tell whether they actually sincerely think this is something they're working toward, and someday, if all goes their way, there will be a white nation. And I don't know where they tend to send everybody else. So help me understand whether it's like a promised land or whether it's an actual something they think they're working toward and someday will take place on the planet.
I think it's both, depending on the people. So the Turner Diaries, which is this novel that was published in the 70s and is kind of known as like the Bible of the racist right. It talks about what would happen. It is this, dystopic, utopic war that happens where the U.S. government is overthrown, and it's incredible. I mean, it's of course incredibly violent, but it imagines that this utopia will form out of all of this chaos and violence. And so, people who there's going to be broad spread murders of people of color, but also of white traders, multiracial families, white liberals, like LGBT people, right? So it really envisioned, I mean, the Turner Diaries as a novel really envisions just broad spread murder, including, like nuclear bombs on Chicago and like New York, right? But then there's like a little bit of land that is still livable, that like this white utopia will flourish in. Like the mythology. Okay. I mean, that book is incredibly central. Like Timothy McVeigh brought photocopies of it with him when he bombed the Oklahoma City building. So, it's been, it still is really, popular and kind of providing this mythology for people in this movement. But if there are also a number of people moving to the Northwest. So I'm from the Northwest. My new research project is actually looking at opposition to white nationalism in the Northwest. But for decades, they've had this, it's called the Northwest Imperative, where white nationalists have been trying to recruit white people to move to the Northwest, which is the inland Northwest is demographically the whitest region in the country. And they're being very successful. There's also this new movement that's trying to bring conservative survivalist evangelical Christians to the Northwest, who they say that you don't have to be white, but it fits very closely with the Northwest imperative. But in terms of like the logistics, I think its focus is like as a mythology and like and a motivator. But I think that there are also people who are very committed to trying to make that happen, which also shows the danger of this movement, right? That for decades, there's evidence that, like more Americans are killed by right-wing extremists in the United States by foreign terrorists or Islamic terrorism. And for a very long time, the FBI and like all of our national security was really focused on like Islamic terrorism.
Yes.
Kind of, I think this is starting to change, but it is a big problem because there is, it is a large group that their goal is overturning the U.S. government.
That's fascinating, Sophie. I hadn't heard about the Northwest Imperative, but it kind of makes sense when you think about, states like Idaho and, I forget the guy's name, but the kind of conflict between the local ranchers there and the federal government. So it sounds as though, as you put it, it's both a promised land mythology, but there is perhaps a growing segment of white nationalists who are going to try and find their corner of the land to make the Turner Diaries actually come true. I mean, it also sounds like a religious apocalyptic narrative, end of the world scenario. Yeah, maybe there'll be lots of chaos, there'll be plenty of violence, but out of that then will emerge a perfect utopia where we will dwell. So it has that religious overtone too, and certainly religious apocalyptic scenarios can draw to the surface a great deal of passionate devotion from people who base their identity in trying to make that come true. You've referenced something when you use the phrase "white traitors." That's something I wanted to ask you about, which has to do with how white nationalists view other white people who would never share their values or their beliefs. Because, to me, whiteness seems like just the thinnest, most superficial aspect of humanity to base your whole identity on. Race has been debunked scientifically. It's not a real thing. And that's been known for some time. And there are just, tens of millions of people with pale skin. And so it has never made sense to me to base your identity on something that seems so vague and literally is only skin deep. And so I wondered, how do they think about white people who believe in racial equality, who perceive what links them with other people as their shared humanity rather than their skin color? And so I was hoping you could say a little bit more about, apparently they see us as just traitors. Are we not really white then to them, but we're something else? What are we?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think they would say that we're like, that we've fallen into like not understanding reality and that we're subjecting ourselves to the potential for violence. This question of like, why would anyone, why is whiteness appealing to this group? That's really what started me in doing this research on online white nationalism, because I was, I had been done anti-racist education with white people, and a lot of especially liberal white people see whiteness as absence, right? They see whiteness as, they don't really understand what it means. It's something that they don't want to really identify with, or they see it as not, there's like an absence of culture, right? Mm-hmm. And so I was wondering, like, what motivates people to really, what do they see in whiteness in like the post-civil rights era? But I think we have to kind of also go back to history, right? That most people who today are understood as white in the United States, if we go back 3, 4, 5, sometimes maybe more generations, our grandparents and great-great-grandparents, right? They all spoke different languages. Most of them didn't speak English, right? They didn't dress the way we do. They didn't eat the way we do. They didn't worship the way we do, right? And most of us don't speak the same languages, right? Like my 3 of my grandparents grew up speaking 3 different languages. I don't know any of them, right? None of them, like they learned English as an assimilation process. And, and I didn't even realize, like, think about that as odd until I was in my 20s, right? So in the United States, what happened in terms of European immigration is that Europeans who assimilated into the set of norms in terms of speaking English, dressing a certain way, and embracing nuclear family values were rewarded. We're rewarded with belonging, we're rewarded with economic privilege, we're rewarded with cultural privilege, but also left a lot behind, right? In terms of cultural traditions. I mean, I grew up where like we would eat lefse, which is like this basically a European, like a Norwegian tortilla, right? Like for Christmas, right? And like that was like some of like the like little residual aspects of my family's cultural practices, right? And so I think that what we end up with today, right, is that so a lot of white people will have like paid for this assimilation by feeling like we lack culture, right? But it also provided all these benefits. And so, and the other thing that happened is that one of the central ways that Europeans assimilated into whiteness in America was through the nuclear family and suburban living. There's this great book by anthropologist Karen Brodkin, like how how Jews became white folks, about the process where, at the beginning of the 20th century, Ashkenazi Jews, even Jews that had pale, were of European descent, like were not considered white, right? And then so like she traces like how these Ashkenazi Jews ended up assimilating into whiteness, and it was largely through adopting nuclear family values, right? And that's what I found all over online white nationalism, was like the celebration of marriage, white marriage, celebration of marriage, celebration of children, and the family represents like this moral center in this worldview, right? And it's like this white family, very explicitly white family, which comes from US history, right? And these policies that privilege white families, that, and in some ways that's like what people assimilated into, right? And that becomes like this moral center of whiteness. And so it's seen as something that can't be multiracial, right? It can't be like it has to be heterosexual. It has to be patriarchal, right? And so those things are like all, when we think about whiteness, right, it can mean many different things. For most white nationalists, white supremacists, it's like all about, it's not just, whiteness is about the family. Like I like to say, like the language of racism is gender, right? And that provides like, protecting children, protecting women, protecting the family becomes kind of a like model for whiteness.
Well, that's really fascinating, Sophie. In a way, it's a kind of a, I'm not sure this is the right metaphor, but a circling the wagons around a whiteness that then becomes a source of identity and a protection against otherwise a lack of assimilation, or a perception that one is not fully American because of the European immigration, as you were talking about, bringing so many different ethnic groups together. And then the price for assimilation then is to leave behind some of those ethnic or cultural markers that might have provided a different way of identifying yourself, but whiteness then becomes a suburban, nuclear family oriented, patriarchal way of identifying yourself. And so, as you point out, there's no room for it to be other than that, or to be multiracial. And there's a protectiveness about that then, and a sense of threat, I guess, part of the zero-sum game, approach. That's fascinating. Thank you so much, Sophie. It's making more sense to me now what they mean by that and why it's taken the shape that it does. So I really appreciate that. That brings me also to another question I wanted to ask you, which is, what's the role of women in white nationalism? And partly, you can't help but notice when you were watching white nationalists on TV at the insurrection, for example, or other protests where they show up. There are a few women, but not that many. And so, what is the role of women? Is it to stay home, or how do they participate? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, white women are central to this movement. I mean, I differentiate between, I call it like white nationalism 1.0 and 2.0. So 1.0 is like these, big platforms trying to create community, trying to embrace respectability, and really trying to tone down misogyny to make more white women join the movement, because you don't get white people without white babies.
Yeah.
To have those babies. And so it's a very gendered model, right, where the men are the warriors, the women are the homemakers, so they'll have these websites where like the women are all talking about homeschooling and home birthing and sharing recipes, and there's dating components to the websites, right? And so white women are very central in terms of reproducing white babies and white culture, right? But the men, right, are then do the warrior work outside of the home, right, and are protecting the home. What you have more recently in terms of the expansion of what's called the Manosphere, so all of these social media spaces that are entirely men, hyper misogynist, is that there's been a melding of many white nationalists have seen those as prime recruiting grounds, right? And so there's different movements like men's rights, incels, so people who identify as involuntarily celibate, gaming place sites, and just kind of fascists. There's pro-Trump sites or just fascist sites that maybe not everyone there has an overtly white supremacist worldview, but they've been there's broad attempts to recruit them into a more white. They've seen them as allies, right, for a white national movement, and a lot of those spaces are so misogynist that even the white supremacist women are not going to feel welcome, right? And so, but then there's like this other aspect, what's happened because of Trump's like epic ability to bring all aspects of conservatives and far right movements together on Twitter in particular, Twitter and Facebook, but is that there's also just a blurring of the lines between conservatives, right, and white nationalists and conspiracy theorists now. So you have like QAnon, which at its core, it's an anti-Semitic conspiracy. Like it's like a centuries-old anti-Semitic conspiracy that has just come to be sprinkled over like contemporary U.S. politics, right? But like the blood libel, like these like fears of, of children being harmed. It's classic anti-Semitism, but that conspiracy has also worked really hard to recruit women, right? Largely through like this rhetoric of saving children. And so many women have been brought into both militia activism, QAnon activism, that's like adjacent to white nationalism. And sometimes it's become very unclear, like even for me as a scholar, in terms of, there are people who identify as white nationalists and are very clear about that. But there's a lot of people who will say, I'm not a white nationalist, I'm not a white supremacist, but they sound like one, right? The language they use, the ideas that they share, right, are. And I think that's a huge success of this movement in terms of using social media to just reach more people. Right? So my new research project is looking at opposition to white nationalism in the Northwest. And I've interviewed people who say, through the 1970s through I think 2000, the Aryan Nations compound was located in North Idaho. It was a white supremacist compound. White supremacists came from all over the country. There's a lot of hate crimes in the region. And I interviewed people this summer who talked about how, it used to be so much easier when they were fighting the Aryan Nations because they were, you knew who you were fighting, right? They were like, people were skinheads. They came with swastika tattoos. Like it was like, they were terrorizing the community, but it was also a known target. And that now they'll have events that are just like, like celebrating immigration, and, dozens of people will show up with guns. And they don't, and they're not they don't have swastika tattoos, but they sound very similar in terms of their messaging to white nationalists. And I think this is like it's a very complicated problem because you end up with, I think it just shows it's a success of the white nationalist movement, that they've been able to, radically share very radical ideas with a much larger segment of the population who will say they're conservative. They won't say that they're white supremacists, but they're saying, they talk the same as the overt white nationalists. And I think it's very dangerous in terms of where this is going.
So some of those ideas then, through careful blurring of lines and rebranding and use of language, enter the mainstream. And people who wouldn't necessarily say of themselves, I'm a white supremacist or I'm a racist, nonetheless wind up espousing ideas and aligning themselves with a movement that is fundamentally antithetical to a multiracial democracy. Sophie, so part of the research you're doing now is about people who are working against this in the Northwest, if I've understood you. And so I'm curious to find out, what have you learned about strategies that are successful in opposing or deconstructing or somehow unmanifesting the power and the appeal of this movement? Because I think whatever these strategies are, we need to all understand them and perhaps start deploying them.
Yeah, so that's my new book project. Within like 2 to 5 years, I would love to come back and like share more detail. But I will say a few things from what I've learned thus far. And one is democracy is a target because it actually works. I feel like democracy is our biggest tool for fighting white nationalism, right? And that democracy that's actually equal and open to everyone, right, is actually what we need. And so we need people to be involved in local, and ensuring that local democratic practices are open and that people can, participate in them. So that's huge. Another is that there needs to be community support for impacted peoples. So there's been a huge spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans. There's anti-Semitic hatred is huge. There's, I feel like for people who aren't Muslim to go and like check out how their Muslim neighbors and community members are doing and feeling, and especially for women who are in hijab or wearing a veil, like it's important to support impacted communities from these movements. And that's not a tangential thing, right? These movements inspire violence, and the violence is not random, right? It's often people there's certain groups that are targeted. And so I think every community really needs like a human rights commission who is going to be independent and is a place where if someone experiences a hate crime, they can contact, and that group can help pass, either pass legislation, but also just ensure that accountability happens, right? Because our hate crimes data is terrible in the United States. I will say that. The FBI has a whole process of documenting hate crimes, but it's hugely lacking. I won't go into the details, but it's a huge problem. And what that means is also that local law enforcement are not good at tracking hate crimes, which means they can sometimes miss out on like crime networks, especially organized white supremacist crime networks. And so local communities, if you can establish a place, that for human rights that targeted communities can see as an ally, that's incredibly useful, right? Both in terms of the targeted communities, but also and protecting them, but also as keeping tabs on like what's actually happening in the community and trying, because I think what ends up happening is that there's all of these efforts about de-radicalization that are very individual, right? And trying to target the people who become radicalized into these movements. And what I've seen is that what's really helpful is for communities themselves to be to be spaces for de-radicalization, where it's not about the individual, but it's about how do you make your community, supportive. And so that, there of course there's always going to be white supremacists in the United States. That's part of the culture. It will always be here. It's about how much power do they have. And being aware of them. There's also it really depends on like where one is. Like if one's a teacher or a parent of white children, it's especially for like it's important to be having conversations so that like if they're and be aware if they're getting radicalized, because increasingly, especially white boys, are being targeted by these groups. And so for teachers, there's a resource from the Western State Center out of Portland, Oregon, around countering white nationalism in schools, which was really helpful. So I think it's all about, I think we end up feeling like we gotta, like, I can't do anything to like de-radicalize a neo-Nazi. And it's like, you shouldn't. Like, I think there are resources out there for that. That's helpful. But I think what's more helpful is for people to, like, wherever you're at, how are you being a voice for, those that are targeted, those that are marginalized? How are you protecting democracy?
Yeah. So part of what I take from what you're saying is the importance of two things. One is a united front within your own community about protecting everybody, and really presenting an allied. There's power in numbers, and there's power in a united front, and to be active about it. You seek out people, find out how they're doing, and to organize. So the message is out there that we are the multiracial democracy, and we're willing to publicly and together join hands to support it. And then with that, voting rights, participate in democracy, run for office, protect voting rights. So those are very, very powerful forces. And I personally can't wait for you to get that book out, Sophie, because it sounds as though it's going to be very important, both as an educational resource about what white nationalists are up to in the northwest corner of the United States, and also some of the tools and resources that we can use in order to strengthen our own multiracial democracy and advance our values and our sense of our united humanity. So, Sophie, I can't thank you enough for coming on the morning show. This has been just extraordinarily insightful and extraordinarily helpful. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you may have to come back another day and talk about the evangelical movement, because it sounded though that's a really engaging conversation about another day, but for another day. But thank you so much, Sophie. It's been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for the work that you're doing. It's really important and it's really impactful. So thank you so much, Sophie, very much. All right. Bye-bye now. Well, that's it for today, everybody. If you miss any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on Port Media's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show at www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the playlist icon and then scroll down to the morning show. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. and will be available also as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Just go to ncmhub.org and click on the cloud icon and then scroll down. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you'll join us again next Thursday at 9 a.m. on Channel 9 for the morning show. Bye for now.